In this video, you're going to get introduced to the CSS grid layout. So first of all, let's understand what the grid word means. Well, if you go to the Cambridge Dictionary and read the definition of the word grid, you will read a pattern or structure made from horizontal and vertical lines crossing each other to form squares. And this is how it would look like. So you've got columns and you've got rows which are made using these lines which cross each other. So you've got horizontal lines and you've got vertical lines. So these lines form these squares. Now if you look at this example, it says in Barcelona the streets are laid out on a grid system. So if you go to Google Maps and go to Barcelona, you will see a good example of a grid system right there. Now, let's go back to web design and understand what the CSS grid layout means. Well, in modern web design, you can build complex CSS layouts using simple CSS, thanks to the grid layouts or the CSS grid layout. So how does it work exactly? Well, if you take your web page and divide it to small squares or rectangles like this, which are contained inside a grid, then you can decide for each of your web components how many of these squares or rectangles it's going to occupy. So for example, you can decide that these rectangles at the bottom are going to be occupied by your footer. You can also decide that you have got an image which will take these 9 squares or rectangles. And this goes on for all your other web components. You can also use CSS media queries to change your layouts from one device size to another. So that's how the grid system works. So the CSS grid layout is actually a two-dimensional grid system that is today native to CSS, and it has become a web standard just like HTML, and it would work on all modern web browsers. So all you need to do to use the CSS grid layout is to create your different columns and rows, decide the dimensions of each row and column. So you can tell your browser what width you want for each column. You can tell it what height you want for each row. And also you can have what we call a gutter between rows and columns. And that's the gap you're going to have between two columns and two rows. Then you can lay out your different elements and have them occupy a certain set of rectangles. So hopefully you're now excited and ready to build your very first grid example. So let's go ahead and do this. In this first example, I created a container div, and inside this div, I created a few divs. Then I styled these by giving a background color to the container and a background color to the different divs. I also added some basic styling to the divs with some margin, which created a gap between these divs. Alright, so what we would like to do is to create a grid layout, then decide where these elements are going to go inside the grid. Now, in this first example, it's going to be a basic grid, meaning that I'm going to make each of these divs occupy one rectangle inside the grid. Alright, so let's go ahead and create our grid. So what you need to do is go to the container that you would like to transform to a grid, then give it a display property, which you're going to set to grid. Now, if you remember Flexbox, we had to give the container a display flex. Now we're giving it a display grid. Now, a quick question. Why would we need to learn the grid layouts if you already know the CSS Flexbox? Well, Flexbox does help us create some complex layouts, and it also helps us solve some common problems like vertical alignments. Now, the grid system also helps us create complex layouts, but there are some things which you would do easily using grid and other things that you would do easily using Flexbox. So it's always a good idea to have a good knowledge of both, because you will build many projects where you're going to use both the grid and Flexbox. So now we gave the display property, which we set to grid, to our container. Now we will need to tell the browser what dimensions we're going to have for our rows and our columns. So let's start with the rows. You're going to use a property called grid template rows. Now we've got here the word templates. Basically, you are actually creating a template where you're going to fit elements later on. And that's exactly what you're doing. So, for example, let's suppose that we're going to go for a template of 4 rows and 4 columns. So what I need to specify here is the dimension of each row. So let's start with something really simple. So let's say that the height of each row is going to be 30 pixels. So I'm going to write 30 pixels 4 times with a space between each 2 values. Then I'm going to move to the columns. And I'm going to use another property, which is grid template columns. Now let's go for 100 pixels for each column. So this is our template. So 4 rows and 4 columns. And we chose these dimensions. Each row is going to have a height of 30 pixels and each column is going to have a width of 100 pixels. Perfect. Let's add some comments to make our code clear. So we're talking here about the rows height, and we're talking here about the columns width. All right. Now I'm going to remove the margin that we set earlier for our divs. And now we can't see anything separating our divs. But thankfully, we've got something with the grid layout called a gutter. And that's the space that you specify between 2 columns and 2 rows. So the way it works is as following. You use the grid gap property and you give it a value. So for example, I'm going to go for 5 pixels. So that's going to be the distance between 2 rows and 2 columns. All right. Now, before I continue, I'm going to add one extra comment here where I'm turning the container to a grid. All right, now I'm going to go back to the dimensions of the columns. And instead of going for 100 pixels for each column, I'm going to use something called FR, which is free available space. And I'm going to give each of the columns 1 FR, which means 1 free available space. What happens here is that each column is going to have a width, which is going to be 1/4 of the width of the container. And that's because we gave each column the same width of 1 free available space. Now, if I give this column, the third one, 2 free available spaces, then it's going to be having twice the width of the other columns. And if I give that one 3 FR, it means that it's going to have 3 times the width of that column, for example. And that one is going to have twice the width of that column. All right, so that's the unit of FR. Now you can combine FR with anything else. So for example, you can set the width of the first column to 25% of the width of the container, and then the remaining space is going to be distributed between these three columns following the values that you gave to each of them. So that the fourth column is going to be 3 times the width of the second column. All right? You can also have the second column having a width of 100 pixels, the first one using a percentage, and the last two using the FR unit. That is absolutely fine. Now let's go back and give each of the columns a width of 1 FR. Now they all have equal widths. What I'm going to do now is simplify this by using the word repeat. Since we are writing 1 FR 4 times, I'm going to simplify that and write repeat 4 times 1 FR. This is exactly the same as writing 1 FR 4 times with spaces between the values. You can change 1 FR to anything you like. For example, 100 pixels or 20% of the width of the container or anything else. Now, let's introduce something called min-max. Now imagine that you want your columns to have a width of one free available space, but you want their minimum width to be at least 300 pixels. So if I set the width to 1 FR, then there is no guarantee that this is going to be at least 300 pixels. So what I need to do is use min-max and give it two values, the min, which is going to be 300 pixels, and the max, which is going to be one free available space. So how does it work exactly? Well, the browser is going to distribute the width of the container between the 4 columns equally. Then it's going to verify if the result's width is greater than 300 pixels. If that's the case, then we're going to use 1 FR. Otherwise, we're going to need to increase the width of the columns to verify the condition of minimum width greater than 300 pixels. Now, I'm going to change the minimum to 400 pixels. Now you can see that 1 FR is not working anymore. So we really need to increase the width of the columns to 400 pixels. And now we are actually overflowing outside the grid. So to fix this, instead of using 4 columns, I'm going to tell the browser to auto-fill the grid with columns by deciding how many columns it can fit inside the container. So instead of 4, I'm going to use the value auto-fill. So in this example, the browser decided to go for 3 columns, giving each column one free space. So if I go back to 300 pixels, then the browser is going to decide to go for 4 columns. So when you use auto-fill, the browser is going to auto-fill your template with columns by fitting the criteria that you give in the second parameter here. So the way it works is as following. The browser is going to try to fit as many columns as possible inside the grid. Now, if it starts with 1 column, then that's going to be too big. Well, if we try 2 columns, then each column is going to have that width, which is still greater than 300 pixels, but we're going to try the next one, 3 columns. So if we go for 3 columns, we are still having a width that is greater than 300 pixels. And we're going to carry on until we get a width that is actually less than 300 pixels. Then we're going to roll back to the previous one. So once you go to 5 columns, then the width does not verify the condition anymore. So it's going to go back to 4 columns, and this is the result we're going to get. All right. Now I'm just going to add some padding right there so that we can see some space between the border of the grid and our elements. So let's go for a padding of 7 pixels, for example, like that. Now what happens if you have fewer items? So for example, let's say we've got only Apple and Facebook. Is the browser still going to go for these dimensions for our columns? Well, let's try. So I'm going to comment all the other divs and see what happens. Well, it still went for that kind of dimension. And the reason why is because we used autofill, which will disregard the amount of content that you place inside the grid. And it will just behave as if you have a high number of items. So it will decide the number of columns based on that. Now, if you want Apple and Facebook to occupy the remaining space inside the grid, then you change autofill to autofit. And this way, any remaining space is going to be occupied. And this is only happening if you've got a few items, like in this scenario. So 2 items will do, 3 items as well. All right. So let's go back to autofill and have all our elements. Now let's go back to our rows and change their height to 1FR and see what happens. Well, since the height of the container is not specified in our styling, then this will have no effect on the height of these elements, because they will just take the minimum height they need to contain their content. But what if we give the container a height, for example, of 600 pixels? So in this scenario, the height of the rows is going to be 1/4 the height of the container, because we set the height of the container and then we set the dimensions of the rows. Let's reduce that to 400, for example, or 300. Or let's go for 250. All right, now in this simple example, we created a template made of 4 rows and 4 columns. And we've got 16 divs, which we could fit easily inside this grid, because it's got 16 rectangles. Now, what if we add more divs inside the container? What is going to happen? Well, let's find out in the next video.